Lord be with you. Today is Tuesday, the 21st of July. Welcome to this pause for prayer. We're reading today from Psalms 132 and 133, from 1 Samuel chapter 6 and from Luke chapter 21. Our readings from the Psalms, from the Old Testament and from the Gospels, all focus on the temple, before the temple, during the temple, and after the temple. In 1 Samuel chapter 6, the Ark of the Covenant begins its journey back to Israel, where it will eventually be placed in the temple planned by David and built by Solomon. In Psalms 132 and 133, these are psalms sung by pilgrims as they made their way to Jerusalem for the great religious festivals. And in Luke chapter 21, Jesus foretells the destruction of the temple. Not one stone will be left upon another. So why was the temple so important to the Jews? Let's start with the ark. Way back in Exodus chapter 29, God said to Moses that the ark, and specifically the space between the outstretched wings of the cherubim, would be where he would meet with Moses. Later, a movable tent, the tabernacle, was created in which the ark rested when the Israelites camped during their period of wandering in the wilderness. And in this tent of meeting, Moses and Aaron were allowed into the presence of God. It was a physical point at which heaven and earth touched, God's meeting place with his people. The Philistines were not part of the covenant people of God, and they had no right to lay claim to this touching place. So in 1 Samuel chapter 6, they send the ark on its journey back to Israel. Eventually, it's brought to Jerusalem by David and installed in the temple by Solomon. As the temple is dedicated, God makes this solemn promise: I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. My heart and my eyes will always be there. So later, as pilgrims make their way up to Jerusalem, we might think of big Christian festivals like Spring Harvest or New Wine. But going up to Jerusalem was much, much more, because this was about going to the one place on earth where God's presence was, where heaven met earth, where people met with God and God met with his people. Think in terms of an audience with a great king in his throne room. This is what the temple was like, the throne room of God. These psalms would be sung by pilgrims on their way up to Jerusalem, recounting David's tireless efforts to bring the ark back and God's covenant oath to David. David would not build God's house, but God would make a house for David, a line of kings that would endure. The pilgrims come remembering what God has done for them, and they come in unity. And when there is unity among God's people, he pours out his blessings. That's why it's such a beautiful thing when God's people today can be in unity. So now we can imagine the shock that the disciples would have felt when Jesus prophesied that the temple would one day be completely destroyed. Back in the year 587 BC, it had been destroyed by the Babylonians and later rebuilt. In the year 70 AD, it would be destroyed forever. All you can see today is just part of one wall with its large stones where Jews often go to pray. If the temple was to be the touching place between heaven and earth, God and man, it is no longer necessary now, because Jesus himself is that touching place. No one comes to the Father except through me, Jesus said. Sacrifices are no longer required because Jesus offered himself as the ultimate sacrifice. A building is no longer required because, as we say in our communion service, the Lord is here, his Spirit is with us. The temple was glorious in its day, but today the church around the world is the temple of God. He no longer dwells in a building, but among his people. So whether we worship in a building like this or not, we are, as St. Paul says, God's temple, and God's Spirit lives in us. And so today, as God's people, the dwelling place of God's Spirit, we can come to him in prayer. Pray with me today for Christians in Syria, where Open Doors is helping to bring them aid. And as we pray for our brothers and sisters in Syria, we pray that they may know God's presence with them today, that they may know that we are praying for them as we come in unity, in that unity of the Spirit. And so we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, for ever and ever. Amen. Now, wherever you are today, whatever you're doing, go in peace to love and serve the Lord in the name of Christ. Amen.